All right. Well, welcome to August Dean's Research Seminar. I think we'll get started. Some people will maybe still coming in. Sorry for the slight delay there. We had a few technical issues. I'd like to begin, though, this afternoon by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I am on today, which is the Boomerang people, as well as the traditional owners of the land you're situated on, and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia for thousands of years, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today, Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor Paul Hemsworth will present his seminar. Paul gained a Bachelor of Agricultural Sciences with honours in 1973 and a PhD in 1978, both here at the University of Melbourne. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, he held positions as the senior research scientist and later a principal scientist and head of the Division of Animal Production at the Victorian Institute of Animal Science at Agriculture Victoria. He then returned to the University of Melbourne in 1997 as a professor and director of the Animal Welfare Science Centre, a role he held until 2017. Professor Hemsworth Paul is internationally recognised for his contribution to animal welfare science and for his pioneering research with Professor Graham Coleman on the role of human-animal interactions on farm animal productivity and welfare. More recently, this research has included studying the effects of human-animal interactions in zoos and also in domestic settings. Paul has studied the influence of a wide range of housing and husbandry practices on common behavioural problems and welfare risks in farm animals, particularly pigs, poultry, sheep, and dairy cattle. Paul is sought both nationally and internationally as a conference speaker. He has an H-index of 48, over 550 publications, 230 refereed journal articles, 35 chapters in internationally distributed books, and he currently supervises 4 students and has previously supervised 23 PhD and 25 Masters and Honours students. In 1992, Paul was the inaugural recipient of Agriculture Victoria's Daniel McAlpine Outstanding Achievement Award for scientific excellence and his contribution to agriculture. He's a fellow of the International Society of Applied Ethology, and he was awarded the Animal Welfare Research Award by the British Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. But more recently, 2019 was a big year for Paul. He was awarded the University's Federation for Animal Welfare Medal for outstanding contributions to animal welfare science. He also became a University of Melbourne Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor and was recognised for significant services to agricultural science and to animal welfare with the award of an Order of Australia. Please welcome Professor Paul Hemsworth, or Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor. Paul, over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation today. I always enjoy talking about this whole topic of human-animal relationships and the impact of the relationships on both the animal particularly, but also the human. And I think as we all recognise that animals in most captive environments receive frequent human contact. And this human contact results in relationships forming between the partners. Now, the research on the human-animal relationship basically commenced in earnest in the 1980s, and it focused on livestock, looking at the human-animal relationship in livestock. Now, our group has been instrumental, has been prominent in identifying the implications of the human-animal relationship on both the animal as well as the human. And we've also identified opportunities whereby we can improve the human-animal relationship with benefits for both partners. And it looks, yeah, sorry, John, no, it's fine. As you indicated, this research that I'm talking about today, Graham Coleman, a psychologist, has also been very instrumental in this research. And in fact, he and I commenced this research in the 1980s. And I'll just describe some of the research that we've done on livestock. And then if we have opportunities, I think we will, I'll talk briefly about the human-animal relationship in zoo settings. So if we can have the next slide, thanks, John. So I will talk about how we study human-animal relationships, just a very quick introduction. I'll talk about the human-animal relationship in agriculture, both negative effects on the animal as well as positive effects. And I'll then talk a little bit about the opportunities to minimise risks to the human-animal relationship from the perspective of the animal. And I'll also talk about some of the positive impacts of human-animal relationship on the animal. So that's what I'm going to try to cover today. I will focus on livestock, but I'll also consider the implications for zoo animals. Next slide, thanks, John. We can conceptualise the human-animal relationship in terms of inter-individual relationships. It's a little bit like social relationships. And these inter-individual relationships, these relationships between the human and the animal, develop as a consequence of the history of regular interactions between the two. And it's this history that actually influences the perception of each partner of the other, and in turn guides the behaviour of the animal. So if we can characterise these interactions between humans and animals, we have an opportunity to understand, firstly, the significance of the interactions for both partners, both the human and the animal. And we can also perhaps understand where the opportunities are to improve this relationship for the benefit of both partners. Next slide, thanks, John. Now we can think about the animal emotional dimensions that affect this relationship. So I've just here presented a situation where the animal's perception of humans is a negative one. In other words, the animal experiences negative emotions or emotional experiences in the presence of the human. And so punishing events such as aversive handling, painful husbandry, veterinary treatment that may be aversive to some extent will elicit negative emotions. And it's those negative emotions that will influence the animal's perception of humans. And if we go to the next slide, John. In contrast, rewarding events such as positive handling, play and feeding animals can result in eliciting positive emotional experiences in animals. And consequently, if the animal has a history of positive emotional experiences with humans, it'll have, obviously, a positive perception of humans. So that's just really useful in terms of conceptualising how this relationship forms. Next slide, thank you, John. And our research, which I'm going to briefly describe now, particularly in the livestock industry, has resulted in this sequential model of the human-animal relationship. If we go to the next slide, thanks. Oh, sorry, John, sorry. If we just go back, yes. So basically this slide indicates that the attitudes of the person handling the animals is a major determinant of how the human behaves, and the human's behaviour will influence the animal's perception of humans. And if the predominant behaviour is negative, if the history of handling is predominantly negative, then the animal will be fearful of humans, and through stress, production and welfare at risk. So that's basically the model that we've developed. And I'd like to now just describe some of the research that forms the basis of developing this model. Next slide, thanks, John. So let's look at human-animal relationships in agriculture. If we go to the next slide very quickly, John. There are three main lines of evidence that support the existence of this model in the livestock industries. Field observations on the human-animal interaction, handling experiments in laboratory settings, and then interventions in the field, examining the impact of targeting stock person attitude and behaviour on consequences for the animal. Thanks, John. Next slide. And if we can have the next slide, thanks, John. Oh, Can we go back one, John, or have we lost the slide? Okay, I think we've lost the slide there. Never mind, John, that's my fault. What a good start to this presentation. Firstly, studying fear. How do we study fear in humans? The most common approach is to conduct behavioural tests in a standard setting in which the approach or avoidance behaviour of the animal is studied. So behavioural tests are the most common way of studying fear responses of humans in animals. We can also look at the physiological response of animals to humans, for example, the acute cortisol response. So in this slide, we're looking at the right-hand side of the model, looking at situations where fear may affect animal productivity. And to study this relationship between fear and animal productivity, our research groups conducted a number of studies in a number of countries, looking at a range of species and examining the relationship between animal fear and animal productivity. Now, the unit of measurement in these studies is the farm. It's not the individual animal or the individual stock person at the farm. It's actually the farm. We've conducted studies on pigs, dairy cattle, meat chicken, and laying hens. And within these studies, there are consistent relationships between animal fear and animal productivity. So in situations where fear is high, then productivity is generally low. And as I said before, well, maybe I didn't say before, but our assessment of animal fear in these studies has basically involved either looking at the approach behaviour of the animal to an experimenter in a standard testing situation, or the avoidance response of the animal to an approaching human in a standard testing situation. And so we've consistently sampled animals at farms to assess their fear response, and we've looked at that relationship with productivity. So in pigs, for example, we find relationships between fear and reproductive performance. In dairy cattle, we find relationships between fear and milk yield. In meat chickens, we find relationships between fear and feed conversion efficiency. And in laying hens, we find relationships between fear and egg production. So these are negative relationships that we see in the field. So these initial studies looking at the fear and productivity prompted a range of studies in the field to look at some of the factors that might be influencing fear. And one of the most obvious factors is the stock person behaviour. And so I'd just like to summarise some of those findings. If we go to the next slide, thanks, John. So to measure stock person behaviour, our approach was really to look at the frequency of the main behaviours used by stock people in interacting with their animals. So, for example, we'd be looking at tactile interactions, auditory interactions, and visual interactions. So tactile interactions obviously are things like slapping or pushing the animal. Visual interactions are fast speed of movement, and auditory interactions are talking or shouting or banging on equipment, for example, to create noise. So again, as we saw, when we looked at fear and productivity at the farms, we found relationships between human behaviour or stock person behaviour and fear responses. We looked at these relationships in pigs, dairy cattle, meat chicken, and laying hens. And again, significant inter-farm correlations between human behaviour and animal behaviour. So, for example, we found that in situations where there was a high proportion of behaviours that we can label as negative, such as slapping, hitting, shouting, fear responses were high in the animals, particularly in pigs and dairy cattle. In poultry, broiler chickens or laying hens, where there was fast speed of movement, unexpected movement, and shouting, fear responses were high. Conversely, in situations where there were a high proportion of positive interactions, such as, for example, with pigs, patting, stroking, talking. Similarly with dairy cattle, fear responses were low. For poultry, where stock people moved slowly and deliberately, no fast speed of movement, fear responses were low. So we're seeing there relationships between the behaviour of the stock person, particularly the nature of the behaviour of the stock person, and fear responses in the animals. If we can go to the next slide, thanks, John. So the next obvious thing to look at was the attitudes of the stock person in relation to their behaviour towards farm animals. And if we could just quickly talk about attitudes, thanks, John, just to describe attitudes briefly. Attitudes, as we know, tend to direct our behaviour, or at least our intended behaviour. Although attitudes are relatively stable, they are resistant to change. Nevertheless, they can be learnt and therefore can be modified. And indeed, reinforcements such as rewarding or punishing experiences can influence attitudes. Direct experience is important. So how individuals, the experiences that individuals have in interacting with animals clearly influence their attitudes, as well as indirect experiences, what they see others doing in terms of handling their animals. So these attitudes are shaped by the experiences of the individual. Next slide, thanks, John. Hello. Good. Thank you, John. A couple of other points about attitude. Obviously, attitudes can't be measured, but a person's response to a series of attitude statements can be used to infer underlying attitudes. So these statements generally are designed to measure one or more of three aspects of expressions of attitudes. The first one is behavioural beliefs, and this is really a combination of one's beliefs about outcomes that occur following a particular behaviour, and very importantly, how one evaluates these outcomes. So it's behavioural beliefs around the particular behaviour in terms of the outcome, and how one evaluates it. Normative beliefs are really just the extent to which a person believes that relevant other people would approve of the behaviour, and the extent to which the individual feels that they need to comply with that other person's expectations. Control beliefs are just perceived control over their behaviour, how well you think you can control your behaviour, or what control you have over your behaviour. So they're the three aspects that psychologists measure through the use of questionnaires to assess attitudes. And if we look at the next slide, thanks, John. So based on the theory of planned behaviour, and this is a well-accepted theory by psychologists, it's really these three forms of behavioural beliefs that determine our behaviour, or at least our intention to behave in a particular manner. So again, in the field, we looked at these relationships between attitude and behaviour. And we used to assess attitudes a series of questionnaires, and I'll provide some examples of these questions in these questionnaires that we've used. But again, we found relationships between attitude and, for example, a positive attitude towards interacting and working with the animal and more positive behaviours used in handling animals. Now these studies that I've just described are observational and correlational. They don't necessarily demonstrate causality. In fact, they don't demonstrate causality. Experimental and comparative studies are required to demonstrate causality. So our next step in our research program was to carry out laboratory studies looking at some of these aspects of the model, as well as field experiments where we attempted to intervene by improving attitudes and behaviour to see whether or not there was any consequent effect on fear and productivity. Next slide, thanks, John, and we'll have a look at some of these experimental studies. Now, I'm not going to present them all because there's a large number, but this is just an example, a number of pig studies done in laboratory studies where we utilised similar handling patterns that were associated with high fear responses in the field. And the imposition of those handling patterns, and the handling treatments occurred daily, but often very briefly, 15 seconds or 30 seconds. They were conducted over a 4, 5, 6 week period, depending on the study. And those handling patterns resulted in increases in fear responses based on assessing their behavioural response to humans, as well as increases in cortisol concentration. And in all these studies, we're talking about basal cortisol concentration. So there's a sustained or prolonged increase in cortisol concentration, indicating that we're dealing or we're achieving perhaps a chronic stress response in these animals. And in the majority of these studies, we saw reductions in productivity, either growth rate or pregnancy rate. Now, I've got a couple of actual results from a couple of experiments here. I won't present them all, but I'll just give you a brief example of the sort of findings that we saw in these handling experiments in lab settings. This is an experiment done some years ago, looking at 4 handling treatments. Positive handling, where it was the handling was predominantly positive in nature to the pig. Control handling with minimal handling, and then inconsistent handling. It was a mixture of positive and negative handling. And that 4th treatment is negative handling. And I can talk about what those treatments in a little bit more detail, what was involved in those treatments later if people wish. 3 of the variables that we looked at was the time to interact with the human, so a measure of fear responses. Basal cortisol concentrations, so they're cortisol concentrations taken repeatedly through indwelling catheters during the day, and growth rate. And you can see with inconsistent handling and negative handling, there's a significant increase in the time to interact with the human. So the animals are more fearful of humans, an increase in basal cortisol concentration, so evidence of chronic stress, and there was a reduction in growth rate in those animals. This is a study with laying hens, a study involving a large number of hens, 144 hens, I think, in the study. The handling treatments were imposed for 17 weeks. The minimal handling treatment was really just minimal human contact, just contact involved with regular management or husbandry, like egg collection, feeding, and monitoring. The additional treatment was the same handling, but it had 15 minutes of handling per week involving slow, deliberate movement around the birds. All the movement was predictable. There was no startling responses. And the 3 measures there are the time that the bird spent in the front of the cage. So if they spend more time in front of the cage, they're obviously less fearful, and that's the case that's happening in the additional treatment. Corticosterone concentrations are reduced with the additional treatment, and hen production is substantially increased in that additional treatment. Next slide, John. We might just go through the next slides quickly. Yes, so that's a similar sort of study with they're actually heifers. Sorry, they're not labelled. They're actually heifers. We're seeing similar effects in that study where there's increases in fear, increases in cortisol with a negative treatment, and also evidence of chronic stress. And in that study, we also saw reductions in milk yield. Good. Let's continue. Thanks, John. Okay. So we had evidence of relationships in the field, but they were just correlational studies. We've got evidence in laboratory settings that negative handling can result in increased fear, increased stress, and risks to productivity. So there's evidence there of risks to welfare and productivity with the sort of negative handling that we see in the field. Our next set of studies, we're really looking at whether or not we could actually change the attitudes and behaviour of stock people in the field to see whether or not we can reduce fear and improve welfare and productivity. And so we used in several studies. Sorry, John, if you just go back a little bit. Have we jumped over one? Yes, sorry, John, just very quickly. Yes, a number of studies in the dairy and pork industry using cognitive behavioural intervention. Sorry, John, we can now go forward. This is a bit messy. Okay, so we used cognitive behavioural interventions, interventions that psychologists use to try to achieve behavioural change. And it basically involves targeting the beliefs that underpin the behaviour. So those key attitudes that were shown to be associated with the behaviour of the stock person, targeting the behaviour of the stock person in question as well. And you need to target both attitudes and behaviour to get sustained change. And then looking at ways in which we can maintain these changes in attitudes and behaviour. And as I said just a few seconds ago, it is important to target both because there's a reciprocal relationship between attitudes and behaviour. Also, the behavioural response of the animal feeds back on the attitudes of the behaviour, the attitudes of the stock person, I should say. So it's quite important targeting these beliefs and attitudes, these beliefs and behaviours, as well as the behaviour of the stock person. Now, I'll just talk about one of the three studies that we've done in the industry looking at cognitive behavioural intervention. And I'd like to talk about one that was done in the dairy industry. So we had two treatments, an intervention treatment and a control treatment. And in this particular study, the study was conducted over a 2-year period. So we observed the animals over the first lactation. That was a pre-intervention period. We observed the animals as well as measuring productivity. We then imposed the treatment, so the intervention treatment at half of the farms, randomly selected, and we imposed a control treatment where there was no intervention. We just spent time with the farmers and stock people at the other half of the farms. Then, following this intervention, we studied the attitudes and behaviour of the stock people again, as well as fear, stress and productivity in the animals following the intervention. Thanks, John. So I've just summarised some of the results here. So I've just presented some of the changes that we're seeing following. So in terms of stock persons' attitudes, we see changes in attitudes, positive changes in attitudes. So for example, beliefs about effort. So this is one of the behavioural belief statements. And there's a series of those statements or questions that are used to study positive beliefs about effort. So for example, their beliefs around using verbal effort as well as physical effort, how difficult animals are to move using various behaviours, how they feel about moving using those behaviours, and how they think other people that are important to them would feel about them using those behaviours. The other attitude, set of attitude beliefs were beliefs about petting. So that's basically talking, petting, stroking the animal, how they feel about it, how often they use it, etc. And you can see that there are improvements in those attitudes. So those attitudes became more positive following the intervention relative to the control farms. If we look at stock person behaviour, quite a dramatic reduction in the use of negative behaviours. And if we look at fear responses in terms of flight distance, so it's measuring the avoidance response of the animal to an approaching human, there was a reduction in flight distance, so they were becoming less fearful. There was evidence of, it's a tendency at the 6% probability level, but evidence of a reduction in milk cortisol concentrations following the intervention, and milk yield at the farms increased by 5% following the intervention. There were 94 farms in this study, so these results are quite substantial. Okay, John, next slide, thank you. So, look, there's evidence based on correlations in the field, as well as experimentation, that this model of human and animal interaction operates in the livestock industries. If we can go on to another slide, John, I think we're going okay for time. Whoops, I might have to speed up a little bit. That pathway that I've just mentioned, the pathway via attitudes, behaviour, fear, stress and productivity, that's perhaps a bit of an oversimplification of what may operate in the industry or what may operate in the field. We also have evidence that other job-related characteristics, in addition to attitudes, other job-related characteristics such as job satisfaction and work motivation are also affected by the intervention, and those things like job satisfaction, work motivation, influence motivation to learn and technical skills, as well as the intention of the individual to utilise those technical skills and knowledge in terms of how they manage the animals. But nevertheless, it looks like attitudes are a key part of influencing animal welfare and productivity, as we've seen in the field. Thanks, John. And yes, go on to the next slide. Yes, I was just going to talk about some of the training programs that are available to industry, available here in Australia and New Zealand. There's also opportunities developing in North America and the UK for some of these programs to be utilised. Maybe we'll move on quickly, John. So I just wanted to talk about positive, if you just go back one slide, sorry, John, that's a messy slide, that one. There's evidence developing over the last decade, I suppose, that there are marked advantages for the animal in situations where the animal has a positive relationship with humans. In other words, where the animal perceives humans in a positively. There are studies that have been conducted with dairy cattle in particular that show that stroking the animal in a manner that's very similar to inter-specific allo-grooming, so how cows may groom others by licking them around the neck and shoulder regions. That sort of stroking in that area by humans can result in reductions in heart rate and a relaxed body posture, and certainly increased approach by cows to humans. There's also evidence with dairy cattle and sheep, for example, that animals with a positive relationship with humans are less stressed in situations where there is a painful husbandry procedure that is being conducted. So there is developing evidence that if the animal has a positive relationship with humans, those animals may be more stress resilient in stressful situations. And I'll just present a couple of studies, just very quickly here, John. I'm conscious of the time. This is a study that was conducted just recently by one of our PhD students, Megan Hayes, looking at the effects of human contact. This was a study looking at both human contact and housing on young piglets. And I'm just presenting some of the data from Megan's study on the effects of human contact. So these are young piglets. They either receive positive handling or they just receive routine contact, as would occur in a commercial situation. And here we're looking at the response of the piglets at 3 days of age and also at 3 weeks of age to several husbandry practices. At 3 days of age, they're what the industry calls, they're processed. They receive an eye injection, an oral vaccination, and their tails are clipped. So aversive procedures for young piglets. But you can see there from that data, if we look at escape behaviour, and we're assessing escape behaviour basically on the magnitude and the intensity of the the escape responses, you can see there that escape behaviour to capture an eye injection is reduced following human contact, regular human contact. Similarly for escape behaviour at oral vaccination, no effect for tail clipping. The duration of vocalisations during those procedures is also reduced. And similarly, at vaccination, intramuscular vaccination, at 3 weeks of age, there's a reduction in their escape behaviour. So evidence there of reduced stress responses for piglets that have received brief positive handling from an early age. Next slide, thanks, John. Yeah. Now, this is a study that we did many years ago, but it's a study that indicates perhaps, again, the impact of positive handling or a positive relationship with humans on animals that are exposed to aversive husbandry, or in this situation, aversive handling. These animals were housed on tethers, they're pregnant gilts, and tether housing results in a chronic stress response. Overlaying the housing, we impose 3 treatments: a positive handling treatment, a negative handling treatment, and a minimal handling treatment. And you can see there that if we look at basal or baseline cortisol concentrations, there is a reduction in the stress response of animals that have been positively handled as compared to negatively handled animals or minimal handling animals. So, you know, again, some evidence of stress resilience in those animals that have a positive relationship with humans. So let's just conclude on that, John. And, okay. So this research clearly indicates the important role of the stock person in managing animals in the livestock industries. And the development of a positive human-animal relationship is obviously important. The research clearly indicates that there are opportunities to improve the human-animal relationship in the livestock industries to not only safeguard but enhance animal welfare and productivity. In addition to that, the fact that if the animal has a positive relationship with humans, then it's likely to experience positive emotional experiences in the presence of humans. So this whole topic of the human-animal relationship is an important one. In the past, we've tended to focus on housing systems and maybe husbandry practices in terms of thinking about how we safeguard animal welfare. And I think in the past, we've neglected that important role of the animal caretaker or the animal owner. So, yes, I was going to talk about human-animal relationships in zoos just to indicate that what we've found in the livestock industries has considerable implication for animals in other captive settings. So zoo animals, companion animals, and lab animals as well. And I was just going to use zoo animals as an example of the sort of potential that exists to improve or to safeguard animal welfare and indeed enhance animal welfare in those other settings. But yeah, wow, that was a bit of a battle, John.
Yeah, you had a bit of a battle with the technology there, didn't you? But well done for working your way through it. And it's never easy when the technology is not working for you, is it? Can I invite people to put questions and answers in the Q&A and not in the chat? You may or may not be able to see the chat, but can you put questions in the Q&A? I see there's a few there already. But while people are thinking, Paul, let me ask you a question that occurred to me. In all of these studies, you're looking at groups of animals. So when you give us the cortisol levels, so the animals that are getting negative experiences that have got high cortisol levels, presumably that's the average from several animals in a group. I guess my question became when I saw that, how much is the variation? If you actually take 20 pigs, are they all very different? Maybe they've all got high cortisol levels, but there could be quite a variation amongst those animals in their cortisol levels, or they could all be at a similar level. And then that led me on to think, which I suppose is a bit of a second question, and that is, what happens if you have one animal that's very skittish and it's very, very sort of scared and easily worked up when a human approaches? Does that settle the other animals into a negative experience? I guess you could test that scientifically by taking one pig that was treated in a negative way and then putting it in with a lot of pigs that have been treated in a positive way and seeing whether that negative one influenced the positive ones. So what is the importance of the group dynamics of the animals in all of this, which you didn't touch on, but you probably have done some work on?
Yeah. Yes, John. Well, firstly, I'll take your second question and then your first. Observational learning operates, so animals do learn from other animals, and it's obviously important for them to learn from other animals because they gain information about both the positive and negative aspects of the setting that they're in. So pigs, for example, if you have a skittish pig that's responding aversively or showing avoidance responses, so withdrawing, vocalising, and pigs also release pheromones in alarm situations as well. That certainly will influence other animals in the group. Most of our initial studies were done with animals individually housed, but we've also done studies with group housed animals. And we've seen the same principles in both situations. But, animals will vary, genetically as well as experientially. You expect variation between animals. And so you'll see that variation in terms of their fear responses as well as their cortisol responses, as well as those limitations on their productivity. But nevertheless, those studies, and there's been a large number of studies done, and we're not the only group that's conducted those studies, but those studies clearly indicate that in highly fear-provoking situations that are consistently occurring, through fear, stress, productivity will be reduced. So I think that was it, John.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Let's go to the questions that are in the Q&A then, and let's see if we can get a few of them answered live, or asked live and then answered live. So, Jeremy Scoose, do you want to start? I don't know whether Mark can open your microphone for us. Jeremy, you there?
Paul, good presentation. You stuck us with the technology as usual.
I think it was my fault.
It's usually your fault. I was just interested though in the commercial opportunities of ProHand. Could you bring the listeners up to date with some of the stuff that's happening in Canada at the moment?
Yes, Jeremy. You can talk about this better than I can, actually. So Jeremy Scoose was the ex-executive officer of the Animal Welfare Science Centre, but he has an honorary appointment at the University of Melbourne. And yes, Jeremy's been at the forefront. Actually, this is a plug for you, Jeremy. I don't like promoting you. But anyway, Jeremy's been at the forefront of trying to roll out these training programs to industry. And in Australia and New Zealand, particularly the pig program for both pig stock people and pig abattoir stock people, it's been very successful. And perhaps the majority of pig stock people in the Australian and New Zealand industry have gone through ProHand. We're currently speaking to Maple Leaf Farms in North America, a large Canadian company, and ProHand is being rolled out over the internet with on-site trainers to all of their stock people in the industry. So it's a bit of a battle to roll out these programs because they're a little bit different from your conventional extension type activity where you're either providing advice on vaccinations or nutrition. Here we're talking about something very personal, how one may change attitudes and behaviour.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Anne Faucet, you've asked a couple of questions. Would you like to ask them live?
Sure. Thank you so much, Paul, for the wonderful presentation and for persisting despite the technological challenges. Just wondered if you'd looked at, we know there's a lot of issues with farmers and mental wellbeing, as well as veterinarians and mental wellbeing. Did you find, or did you look for any evidence that mental illness in stock persons or farmers could be associated with poor animal welfare?
No, we didn't. It's a very important question, and it's becoming more and more important these days. We are currently discussing ways of looking at mental health in companion animal owners. So one of our PhD students, Carmen Glanville, is studying these human-animal relationships amongst dog owners and dogs. And one of the aspects that she's particularly interested in is the mental health of dog owners. But I would imagine that one's experiences in owning a dog may have quite marked effects on one's mental health, because dogs are often so important for individuals. So look, it's an area that I think has been neglected. And it's a very good question that needs to be evaluated.
And then I just had one follow-up question, if I may, which was,
please do.
How did you ensure that you alluded to CBT in changing people's behaviour, and you mentioned that the third step is to actually maintain the behaviour. And I know you didn't do the psychology component as such, but how do we maintain this improved behaviour of stock people? Because what if there's sort of a toxic workplace or a negative workplace? Does that undermine those behaviour changes?
Yeah, they're very good questions. So in terms of targeting attitudes and behaviour, it's all about providing evidence around the importance of this topic.
Paul, I think we've lost Paul there, haven't we? He might come back in.
If you
Paul, can I
stop people in the industry, there's variation in attitudes and behaviours. No? Can you hear me, John?
Yeah, I can.
Oh,
we missed you for a few moments. But if you do that and keep your camera off, maybe you could start the answer to that bit of the question again, because we missed the start of it. Yeah.
Well, you can't say I'm not consistent with the use of technology. I certainly am consistent. Yes, very good question, Anne, in relation to maintaining change. But the first part is actually to target those attitudes and behaviour that you want change, and that's all about providing evidence to people about the importance of this topic and the sort of variation that exists in attitudes and behaviour in the field, and therefore, the opportunities for improvement. And once you've planted the seed, reinforcement's critical. And one of the key elements that we promote, so we provide reinforcement in terms of a follow-up program, as well as opportunities wherever possible for newsletters, raising questions of whether or not people have seen change. But one of the important recommendations is to observe how your animals respond. And by observing how your animals respond, that provides the positive reinforcement. And in that model, not only do attitudes affect behaviour and behaviour feedback on attitudes, but how the animal behaves influences your attitude. So if you can get an improvement in attitudes, that should be self-reinforcing over time.
Thank you.
Paul, I've got a question here that says anonymous, so fine, that's no problem, I'll read it. And this is a topic that I think a lot of people are interested in, and it's about animals for slaughter. So the question is, when it comes to the slaughter of animals for human consumption, does your research indicate any changes in their fear or escape tendencies once they've had positive human interactions? I suppose there's two questions here, it seems to my mind. One is the positive or negative interaction at the slaughterhouse, but one is the longer term thing. If you've had animals that have had positive human interactions throughout the time they've been kept as livestock, perhaps they have a worse worse experience at the abattoir. I don't know. What's the linkage there, Paul?
Yeah, no, I think, okay, we're currently looking at that, John, with an ARC linkage project where we're looking at the effects of early human contact as well as housing. And what we're seeing at the moment is that early positive human contact results in those animals being much more resilient during routine husbandry practices, for example. And I provide a little bit of evidence of that with the young pig. At the abattoir, which is quite a fear-provoking setting for animals, one would expect that those animals that are less fearful of humans, and there's lots of human contact in abattoirs that are less fearful of humans, are going to be a little bit more resilient to that process. So this study that we've just completed, we had something like 140 animals that had been handled positively or negatively. They've been slaughtered, and we've got blood samples as well as a whole range of observations. That's currently being analysed. We've seen some evidence in situations where animals are handled positively at abattoirs for them to be less stressed, to see less effect on some of the metabolic variables such as glucose and lactate, and to see some changes in meat quality where they've been positively handled as compared to normally handled.
Okay, thank you for that, Paul. Now we've got a few other questions, but we don't have too many more minutes left. So I think let's see if we can whip through a few of these quite quickly, quick questions and quick answers. And the first would be from Veronica Wade. Veronica, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can, yep.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I just had a question on the behaviour of animals in relation to the behaviour and attitudes of different staff. And I wondered whether you saw any variation in animal behaviour and I guess a gravitation of animals towards staff with whom they've had a positive experience with, as opposed to maybe shying away from staff that they've had a negative experience with. I'm just thinking in terms of like domestic animals where you see, say, dogs can kind of gravitate towards some people and shy away from others. And I wondered if that was the same in livestock.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, animals that are interacting with humans, they'll become very sensitive to subtle behavioural changes, for example, and maybe some physical differences. So they will be utilising that sort of information in terms of how they may behave. We've looked at that. I'll just go back another step. Certainly animals can discriminate between handlers that have handled them positively or negatively, particularly if there's some distinct features about them, like clothing or where the handling occurred. So they'll learn to discriminate. However, it is dangerous to try to discriminate if they've been handled by some people negatively, in case they make errors. So what we've found is that animals in commercial settings, in livestock settings, for example, their fear responses will be predominantly determined by the most aversive handler, where there are groups of handlers working. So even though they may be handled by some as positive, their fear responses are determined by those that are most aversive in their handling. So that person's having an undue influence. But animals can discriminate, particularly if there's some obvious cues. But it is dangerous to discriminate in some situations, in case, particularly if you've had some aversive handling in the past.
Okay, what I'm going to propose, given the time, is that we'll call this to a close here. And Paul will, I hope, reply to those people that have got some remaining questions, and he can do that after the seminar's finished. So let's try and, let's just close this because Paul isn't coming back. So I'd like to thank Paul for his presentation, and which he's done despite all the difficulties in the technology. I think he's got some problems in wherever he lives there. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined the seminar series today, and I hope you'll be able to join us for our next seminar, which will be on the 14th of September, when we'll have Professor Simon Bailey, who's going to talk about insulin dysregulation, obesity, and laminitis in horses. Thank you all for joining us today, and I wish you a very pleasant and successful week. Thank you. Bye-bye.